It seems the whole world is bent on censorship. It's really increasing. Ireland is looking at deep censorship. Of course, in Canada, Justin Trudeau has proposed Bill C-63, perhaps the most draconian censorship bill in the free world. We see in Brazil, Twitter is being banned and Elon Musk criminalized by a judge who doesn't like the free speech on that platform one bit. Well, same with Scotland. You might recall a video I did a couple of years ago when I went through an astonishing bill championed by the First Minister of that country, Hamza Yousaf. He's an unusual figure to be calling for censorship of hate speech, given this absolutely bigoted speech that he himself gave, dripping for contempt for what he called white people. Take a look at this.
But why are we so surprised when the most senior positions in Scotland are filled almost exclusively by those who are white? Take my portfolio alone. The Lord President, white. The Lord Justice Clerk, white. Every High Court judge, white. The Lord Advocate, white. The Solicitor General, white. The Chief Constable, white. Every Deputy Chief Constable, white. Every Assistant Chief Constable, white. The Head of the Law Society, white. The Head of the Faculty of Advocates, white. Every Prison Governor, white. And not just Justice. The Chief Medical Officer, white. The Chief Nursing Officer, white. The Chief Veterinary Officer, white. The Chief Social Work Advisor, white. Almost every trade union in this country headed by people who are white. In the Scottish Government, every Director General is white. Every chair of every public body is white. That is not good enough.
How can someone who is so clearly driven by racial animus then pass a law that would trap others for what he considers racial animus? Shouldn't he be the one charged under his own law? Or preferably, shouldn't we all be allowed to have freedom of speech, and shouldn't we be able to judge for ourselves what is odious and what is impermissible rather than having the police do so? Well, that's my opinion, but that's not the law. Hamza Yousaf's censorship bill is now law in Britain. And wouldn't you know it, one of the first people complained about is a member of Parliament. His name is Neil Hanvey. And let me read to you a tweet that he published last week. So my office got a call from Police Scotland today advising me that I had been reported for a hate crime based on an undisclosed tweet. Can you believe that? You don't even know the case against you. It's an undisclosed tweet. They had assessed the complaint and were notifying me that they were taking no further action as they did not deem it necessary. But still, a call from the police, that's a way of saying, we've got our eyes on you, buddy. Police officers are already under enormous pressure, but now they are having to spend their precious time assessing the perceptions of how offended someone feels over others' lawfully expressed opinions. This is utterly ridiculous, illiberal, wasteful, and unacceptable in a supposedly liberal democracy where political discourse should be free and open. The tweet continues. I recall when I reviewed this bill a couple of years ago that the police took the unusual step of coming out in public against it, saying that it would stress their relations with ordinary Scots, it would lower the police's reputation in the community, and divert them from more important work. Well, joining us now via Skype from the United Kingdom is Neil Hanvey, the MP who received that phone call from police. Mr. Hanvey, what a pleasure to have you join us. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you, Ezra. Lovely to be with you.
I am not surprised that a political leader such as yourself was one of the first targets of the censorship bill. But in fact, thousands of complaints have been filed in the very first week. Am I right?
Yes, you're correct. And referencing your earlier comments about the what is commonly referred to as the white speech by Hamza Yousaf in the Scottish Parliament, that received the most complaints of those many thousands of complaints. So it's quite interesting that the architect of this legislation has actually ended up being one of the targets in its first week since launch. But yeah, I mean, I was expecting, I wrote about the potential impact of this legislation back in October in a newspaper article setting out my concerns about how it would be used for vexatious purposes to attack political opponents or indeed anyone with whom you disagreed with. So it has come to pass that I was reported to Police Scotland, who had to waste their precious resource assessing the complaint, contacting me to tell me that I hadn't done anything wrong and that they weren't going to take the matter any further. However, a political opponent of mine, somebody from the Conservative Party in Scotland, Murdo Fraser, also found out in recent weeks that he has a non-crime hate incident recorded against his name. And so the question I have to ask is, well, what was the tweet? How was it investigated? Who made the complaint? And do I have a non-crime hate incident against my previously unblemished character?
That's a great question. I'm so glad you raised it. In Canada, we don't have such a thing as that, a non-crime hate incident. What I think that means, correct me if I'm wrong, is that you've done something, quote, wrong, but it hasn't risen to a level where the police or the prosecutors think there's a reasonable likelihood of conviction. But it's still on your record. So I find this an astonishing thing for police to have at all. It goes on your record, not your criminal record, but a record, and it implies that you're a hater. And in your case, it sounds like you still don't even know what the complaint against you was for.
That's correct. So the police have been challenged on these non-crime hate incidents down south in England, and they have been asked by the Secretary of the Home Secretary to stop that practice because it is deemed to be unlawful and against human rights of citizens. And so the same argument should prevail in Scotland with this non-crime hate incidents activity. But there's a real possibility that members of the public could have a non-crime hate incident recorded against their name, and that could potentially impact on their employment, their current employment, or indeed any future job that they go for. It's a really concerning issue. And the fundamental problem with this is, you mentioned that there needed to be some assessment of whether it reached a criminal threshold. Well, that's not actually the case. It all rests on the person who's offended's perception. And that is the only test that is required for a non-crime hate incident to be recorded against your name.
Okay, thank you for that information. This is an alien concept here in Canada, even though we inherited so much of our legal system from the UK. Now, let me ask you a personal question before we get back to the law. You said the police phoned you to say, we're not proceeding. But, I mean, you're a sophisticated man. You're a member of Parliament. You understand laws and police. You're confident. You have a media profile. You're a tougher nut to crack than an ordinary Scot who probably has no interaction with police or lawyers or the court system. And if they got such a phone call, I would suggest it would be terrifying. Even if the official message was, don't worry, we're not coming from you now, the subtext would be, you're on our radar, we know who you are, we know where you are, we know something about you, you better watch your P's and Q's. So let me ask you, do you feel like this phone call to you by the police was a kind of warning? Or, what was it like?
Well, the reality was they didn't speak to me directly. They spoke to a member of my team. So the message was relayed to me via a third party. There's somebody that I absolutely trust, but, that in itself is not particularly great practice. But
yeah, talk about, that's a confidential matter, you would think. But you would think they would say, may I please have an arranged conversation with Mr. Hanvey directly? That's insane that they were leaking this gossipy, defamatory fact about you. Like you say, you trust this person, but that's sloppy practice, or maybe that too is deliberate.
Well, indeed. The fundamental issue with the Hate Crime Act as it stands is that the report can be made based purely on perception. And the argument that the First Minister has advanced in recent days has been that it's important to get a sense of what kind of hate is out there. And that's why non-crime hate incident reporting and recording of it is important, because it helps tell us about the prevalence of so-called hate. But actually all it does is it tells us how vexatious certain parts of the population are and how many complaints they're prepared to make against an individual. And the First Minister has found out on the back of his white speech that he can be targeted in that way also. But there's a really important point here with the legislation. So the criminal test is really quite high, and there is a freedom of expression provision within the Act. But what there isn't is a detailed explanatory note that gives people information about how that test may be met, and what kind of speech would not be classed as hate speech. And that's really important for two reasons. One, there is no carve-out for what is generally referred to as gender-critical views, and that's not been clarified. Sex is not protected characteristics within the Act, so therefore women's rights are fair game. And those are two significant issues that I'm very concerned about personally. And the reason that those provisions are not there, and this is my view, and the reason that the explanatory notes are not clear, is that it would take someone a very arduous process through a criminal trial to discover that what they did was not criminal and didn't meet the criminal test than what they said was covered by the freedom of expression provision. And the reason, as I said, those clarifications were not there was because it's my belief that the Scottish Government had the very clear intention of exerting a chilling effect on the people of Scotland to stop them talking about some of the important political issues that we face, particularly around identity politics.